Okay, I'm going to make a video here which I would ask anyone watching this to just look at the video the whole way through before commenting or judging. Please look at the whole video first, because the subject I'm going to talk about is a sensitive one and the sort of one that gets reactions. So please listen to the whole video first before commenting. So I've just watched a clip from the 2008 fight between Bernard Hopkins and Joe Calzaghe. Bernard Hopkins is an African American fighter. Joe Calzaghe is a white British fighter, Welsh Italian. The significance of that is that during the lead up to this fight, it was Joe Calzaghe's last fight he won. They had a bit of a square off, and Hopkins said, "I will never lose to a white fighter. I will never lose to a white guy," and he repeated this several times. This wasn't a sort of slip of the tongue. He repeated it several times, and it's quite clear what he meant. Now, unfortunately, boxing has quite a long history of racially motivated statements and race politics, especially the turn of the last century when black fighters were treated in an appalling way. I remember at the turn of the last century, well, I don't remember personally, but because I wasn't there, but every time Jack Johnson, the great Jack Johnson, won a fight, there used to be extremely racist responses and sometimes even race riots. So as far as I'm concerned, by the way, this fight was 2008. All Bernard Hopkins is doing here is digging up the sort of race politics of the past, which has no place in boxing. Calzaghe never retorted with any sort of counter-racist remarks, I'm pleased to say. There has also been racist remarks against black fighters. In the 1980 bout between Alan Minter and Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Minter was accused of saying, "I'll never lose to a black man," which is an equally boneheaded statement. And I would say I would condemn both Bernard Hopkins and earlier, I should say Minter denied making that comment. I don't know if he did or didn't, but if he did make it, that's equally disgraceful. I really wish people could just recognize racism for what it is. Racism is racism. It's not a damn competition to see which ethnic group is the most racist. The truth is, there have been examples of racism coming from all ethnic groups. That's a simple fact. What I want to talk about in this video is racism directed against white people. Now, I know there's going to be some people responding to this, some Asian people, some black people, who will say, "Oh, you whites have no right to talk about racism. You had slavery for hundreds of years, you were the colonizers," and so on. Well, firstly, I don't deny that. At no point do I claim that there isn't a history of white people being guilty of repression, serious repression. You know, if you look at some of the lynching photographs from the United States of African Americans lynched in the first half of the 20th century, it is sickening. It really is sickening. And it is true that white people have been responsible for enormous repression. But what I have absolute contempt for is this idea that white people and white people alone are responsible for racism. And I think this stems from a sort of idea that because white people are perceived to have been, let's say, made the profits from this oppression, become successful from this oppression in terms of the general consensus is it's white countries, so to speak, that are the powerful countries, therefore only white people are guilty of repression. But there's many examples in history of white people themselves having been the victims of repression, and I will quote several examples. The Holocaust. The simple fact is, most of the victims of that were white Jewish people. Yes, it's true that homosexuals, black people, were also persecuted, but most victims were white. That's just a fact. Most of the victims in Stalin's gulags were white people. Most of the victims of the Ukrainian Holodomor, also a part of Stalin's persecution, were white. Most of the victims at Srebrenica were white. Now you can make an argument those who were doing the persecuting in those examples were also white, but what I'm trying to counter here is the idea that white people never suffer. It's a perverse argument, and one that simply doesn't add up. Just because so-called white countries tend to be wealthier and tend to be the superpowers doesn't mean anything. There are examples of racism in every ethnic group. This is a simple fact. And I'm so sick of this idea that it should be some sort of competition to see which group is the most racist. I absolutely abhor racism of all kinds, and I've seen it from all groups of people. I've seen white racism. I've seen some boneheaded white supremacists. There's many examples of it. Unfortunately, leading right up to the modern day, we look at Anders Breivik in Norway. There's plenty of hate groups in the United States. But this idea that only white people are capable of racism, I think that in itself is blatantly a racist position to take. If you believe that only white people are capable of racism, by definition you are a racist, because you're judging people by the colour of their skin. And I always see these sort of comments coming from some Asians and some black people saying that you whites have done this, you whites have done that. And what I resent about that sort of mentality is its generalizing tones. You whites. As if all white people are the same. That's a racist position to take, to insinuate that all white people are the same. Let's not forget, in the US Civil Rights Movement, there were many white people who strongly supported that movement, and often risked personal injury and insult to support their black brothers and sisters. That little fact seems to be forgotten by some black supremacists. In the early days of the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther movement, white people who wanted to help were shunned. Now I recognise the argument that they wanted to prove that they could defend themselves, but the idea was one of collective vilification. All whites are racists. I was not born a white man. I had no choice as to what my skin tone was. In the same way that a Chinese guy, or a Hispanic guy, or a black guy has no choice about his skin pigmentation. The only reason I actually would prefer not to make a video like this, I'd prefer not to focus on race. But I just feel it is important, because looking at the comments under that video, a lot of people were basically making excuses for Bernard Hopkins. Let's be clear, this is a very accomplished professional boxer. He's in a position of responsibility, and for him to make those sort of comments in the year 2008 are shameful. This wasn't a sort of counter argument to anything Joe Calzaghe had said. Calzaghe's not a racist fighter. Calzaghe, in my opinion, is for the most part a very professional fighter. You'd never get Manny Pacquiao saying something like this, and there's many great black fighters who would never use these sort of pathetic racial overtones. It's the most boneheaded thing in the world to respond to racism by vilifying an entire race as racist. I have seen examples of racism in China, but am I going to say that 1.4 billion Chinese people are racist? Of course not. By the same token, you cannot generalize millions of white people as racists because there are some white racists, and because there has been a history of white racism, whether it be in the United States or the transatlantic slave trade or colonialism. Because of that history, you cannot blame all white people for that, especially when many white people have been vocally condemning that history. There are examples of oppression coming from every ethnic group, and just for the record, the main persecution of African people in the last 50 years has been from black African dictators. That is a simple fact. I'm not trying to shit stir anything with that. I'm simply observing a fact. With the exception of Ian Smith in Rhodesia, most African dictators who have oppressed African people have been black. This is a fact. Some of the most vicious racism on the African continent has been tribal. Again, this is a simple fact. Look at the Rwandan genocide. That wasn't... You could argue, yeah, it was French weapons funding the Hutu militias, but the point is, the Hutus believed they were racially superior to the Tutsis. And the same thing could be said in the earlier genocides in Burundi. The point I'm making is this notion that only white people are guilty of racism is a perverse argument. And I, as a white man, I do get fed up of my entire ethnic group being vilified in this way. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I would never ever judge a man or a woman based on their skin pigmentation. I would never judge a black man because he's black. I would never judge an Asian guy because he's Asian. I would never judge a Hispanic guy because he's Hispanic. Yes, it's true you get trends in each ethnic group. There is certain trends. But those trends are never, ever universal. This mentality of generalizing an entire race does not help anyone. And all it does is fuel the racists. Because then they turn around and say, oh, look how reactionary these black guys are. Look how out of control they are. Look at their anger problems, etc. So it becomes a vicious cycle. And it's just such a boneheaded mentality. I'm so sick of it. And unfortunately in the world of sports, this does still exist. It exists in boxing and football still, especially those two sports. I mean, it's much better than it was, but the mentality is still there among some people who frankly should know better. You know, professional boxers are supposed to be role models, and all Bernard Hopkins was doing with that statement is making a sort of black power statement. And it doesn't prove anything. By the way, he lost the fight, so his statement's factually wrong anyway. But he didn't lose the fight because he's a black man. He lost the fight because Joe Calzaghe won the fight. And Calzaghe didn't win the fight because he's a white guy. I mean, you can find examples of Asian boxers, Hispanic boxers, black boxers and white boxers who have won fights. And you can find examples where they have lost fights against a guy from another ethnic group. So anyone who thinks in this mentality that white fighters are better, black fighters are better, etc., it's a primitive mentality. It does nothing for the sport, and it really bugs me. And my message to any black guys out there, any Asian guys out there, any Hispanic guys out there who want to blame the entire white race because of the actions of some, you need to change your mindset. You need to change this mentality you have whereby you're thinking in terms of colour. Colour, colour, colour. Everything's about race. And it's pathetic. There are plenty of responsible black guys, Asian guys, Hispanic guys who don't think in these terms. You never hear Manny Pacquiao gloating like, oh, I'm superior because I'm an Asian fighter. You never see him saying that. And you never see... There's other black fighters who are a lot more responsible. I believe Sugar Ray Leonard would be a good example. You never see him gloating he was a great fighter because he was black. He was a great fighter because he was a great fighter. I don't think Joe Louis or Sugar Ray Robinson ever used... Yeah, they would have had a certain identity as African Americans, but I don't believe they ever gloated about it. And it has no place in the sport. You do not tackle racism by reverse racism. It's a boneheaded mentality. I would argue this point against any white racists who, because sometimes they may, or white people may be the victim of racism, then they turn around and generalize all black people or all Asians. I've seen this mentality from some Asians online who think that because occasionally, for example, Chinese Americans may suffer racism, then they can go and vilify the entire white race. I'm not stupid. I know history. I know about transatlantic slavery. I know about colonialism. I don't need a history lesson. I know about those things. But I'm not going to personally apologise, because I did not choose the colour of my skin when I was born. And I've come to the end of the bandwidth, so I'll leave it there.